Welcome back. My name is Matthew Carnes. I'm an associate professor over at Georgetown University in our government department, and I have the pleasure of directing our Center for Latin American Studies. And I was thrilled when John asked me to moderate this panel. As you know, throughout the day, we've been making our way through about the last century. And as John said, this panel becomes very contemporary. So contemporary, in fact, that I was thinking in some ways we stretched the last 30 years. So we say 1990 to 2020, actually. John kind of ambitiously put here, we're not quite there yet. We can anticipate, we can think ahead. But actually, in some ways, we're also in the last 30 minutes. As I was opening my phone right before I walked up here, there was a press release from the Kino Border Initiative, which Sean works at, who will be the last of our speakers, speaking about the new changes to the Remain in Mexico policy and deportations. And so we are incredibly contemporary when we're talking on this panel today. So I'm very excited to hear each of these presentations. And what I'll do is introduce each of the speakers right before they present, and then we'll have a great conversation about especially the ways that migration and migrants are transforming our understanding of our binational, transnational relationship. So our first speaker is Maria del Socorro Castañeda Liles. Maria del Socorro is co-founder of Becoming Mujeres, a program that offers seminars and workshops to Latina teens and their female caregivers. Previously, she taught in the Department of Religious Studies at Santa Clara University, and she is the author of the 2018 Oxford book, Our Lady of Everyday Life, La Virgen de Guadalupe and the Catholic Imagination of Mexican Women in America. And her presentation today will be The Making of Girls in Mexican Catholic Imagination, Women Speak on Shame, Violence, and La Virgen. Socorro.
Buenas tardes, ¿cómo están? Bien? Okay. I'm very excited to be here, and I would like to thank Professor John Totino for reaching out to me and inviting me to share my work with all of you. It's an honor to be here with all of you. I would also like to thank all the institutions that made this conference happen. I'm going to pass around my book. I call it my second Lupita. I have my daughter, her name's Lupita, or there's a book named On Our Lady of Guadalupe. I don't have a picture of it on the slide, so I'm going to go ahead and pass this so you can be familiar. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to share with you a small slice of the pan dulce that is my book, and what I see our panel doing is really bringing the voices of the people to the present moment, bringing them to this room. And my title of the presentation is, as I was mentioned, The Making of Girls. And before I begin, I'd like to say that the book is based on interviews of 100 women, all of Mexican origin, first generation working class. They were divided in 3 different cohorts: young college women, mothers, and older women. The 2 stories that I'm going to share with you today, one comes from the mother cohort and another one from the older cohort. Children born into Mexican families, Mexican Catholic families, become familiar with Catholic customs and imagery even before they are able to fully comprehend their significance. And I hit the clicker here. Let me show you. Like this. There you go. Religious material objects in their homes, such as home altars, votive candles, and statuettes of saints, which typically come with family stories of miracles granted, are some of the first media of transmission of faith. These Catholic traditions are passed on through the women in the family. It is within this intricate web of matrilineal relationships between religion and secular life, or heaven and earth, and between children, mothers, and grandmothers, that many Mexican children are first socialized into Catholic culture. The mother's Catholic devotion then becomes the first religious cultural template from within which children learn to see themselves as people of faith in a specific sociocultural context. In this same way, early in a child's life, Our Lady of Guadalupe becomes a sacred symbol capable of synthesizing the ethos and worldview in which he or she is being socialized. The sense of connectedness that the women in my study felt to Our Lady of Guadalupe in their childhoods was not necessarily tied to the details of the apparition story. She became palpable in films, in theatrical plays about the apparition story, in songs about La Virgen, flower offerings, and family traditions like home altars and dressing girls and boys in traditional indigenous clothing on her feast day. And I have a couple of examples here. I'm going back. Oh, it's not working. I don't know what I did. Okay, I'll keep going. Okay, thank you. Okay. Okay, there you go. Okay, thank you. When the women in my study were children, La Virgen came to life every time they witnessed their mothers and abuelitas talk to La Virgen or light a candle to her for a friend or family member who was about to cross the border. As they grew and matured, they developed a more complex understanding of Our Lady Guadalupe's significance in Mexican Catholicism. By the time they became young adults, they saw La Virgen as having the capability to transform their sorrows and pain into hope and resilience. It is in this way that La Virgen became a central figure in their Catholic imagination in their adult years. Their perception of La Virgen as a celestial mother who would never abandon her daughters moved them at varying degrees to transgress limiting views of women's place in the family and society. Through their stories this afternoon, Rosario and Esperanza will teach us who La Virgen is and means in the lives of immigrant women today. When I first met Rosario, she was 68 at the time, I felt intimidated by her, not because she was aloof, but because she was always very proper and carried herself with elegance and grace. She was not outspoken like the other women at the local senior center. I never heard her laugh out loud. On the contrary, she was quiet and always sat at the same table with her aunt and uncle. She was always dressed in beautiful long dresses and shawls. Sometimes she wore a flower on her head that complemented her earrings, which swayed at the rhythm of her walk as they caressed her beautiful cinnamon skin. Her black hair was always nicely swept up into a French twist, just like the ones worn by the movie stars of the 1940s. After a few days, I finally got the courage to talk to her. I slowly made my way up to where she was sitting. Rosario looked at me, and her gentle smile melted my heart and made me feel welcome. I introduced myself and told her that I was writing a book on La Virgen. She suggested that we go to the next room because Loteria was about to start. I asked her to tell me about herself, and she opened up right away, as if she were talking to an old friend. When I asked her about her experience growing up Catholic, she did not hesitate to quickly make reference to La Virgen by saying, quote, "As my grandmother would say, La Virgen will always be with us. La Virgen will always protect you, the family and our children. La Virgen will always give you strength and never abandon you," end of quote. Her grandmother's words, as we will learn, had a lasting impact on Rosario. When I asked if La Virgen had ever granted her a miracle, she quickly said yes and added, "Ella es muy milagrosa. She is very miraculous." I proceeded to ask what she meant by her statement. Her expression quickly changed from happy and relaxed to pensive and reflective. At that moment, I knew that this miracle was a life-changing experience for her. Rosario was 13 when her maternal and paternal grandfathers married her off to a 20-year-old man whom she did not know. He was a stranger, but she felt she had to respect her grandfather's decision, for according to her, they were acting in her best interest. Rosario and her husband had a total of 12 children, but they never lived together as a family. Puzzled, I asked why. She responded that he would only come by from time to time, and every time he visited her, he left her pregnant. I asked if he was ever physically abusive. She immediately responded, "Hasta eso que no, nunca me pegó. Actually, no, he never hit me." After a minute's pause, in a quiet, somber way, she adds, "Bueno, no hasta la última vez que lo miré. Well, not until the last time I saw him." And she goes on, quote, "One day I got home from the cannery and I locked the front door and lay down on the couch. My husband showed up at my doorstep, and when he saw he could not open the door, he went in through the bathroom window. Next thing I knew, for I had fallen asleep on the couch, he was standing next to me and I had blood all over me. He had cut my stomach open and I could see my guts. They were all hanging like this. I was 9 months pregnant with twins. All I had time to do is to put my children and myself in the hands of La Virgencita. I got a gun I had under the couch and I shot him. I don't know how I did it. I was really afraid, but La Virgencita gave me the strength and I shot him. He had cut open the head of one of the twins and the leg of the other one. The first one died and the second one survived. My husband ran to get away, but the police eventually found him and he went to prison. Sí, mi Virgencita es muy milagrosa. Yes, mi Virgencita is very miraculous. I have a lot of faith in her." End of quote. Decades have passed. The son who survived is now a grown man, and he still bears a scar on his leg. Rosario's mental and physical scars have remained, but the way that she carried herself is a testimony of her resilience anchored in her Catholic faith and devotion to Our Lady of Guadalupe. To this day, she attributes her survival and that of her child to La Virgen. Rosario's story of physical violence suggests that La Virgen figures into how women in this study understand and respond to physical and psychological domestic violence. To place Rosario's experience into perspective, during their lifetime, approximately 1 in 4 women will experience severe violence by an intimate partner. Alcohol abuse and domestic violence are further complicated when the victim is undocumented. In addition to legal status, race, class, and gender oppression, language barriers and minimal social networks further marginalize victims. Most cases of domestic violence, unsurprisingly, go unreported. Often victims do not seek help because they fear deportation. In the midst of these destructive social forces among the women in this study, La Virgen becomes a potential accessible resource for confronting the physical and psychological abuse in their lives. Unfortunately, like Rosario, this was the case for Candelaria. She was 39 at the time of the interview. Candelaria was raised by both of her parents to be respectful, particularly to men. She was taught to not talk back when other people are talking. To be obedient and remain silent was a sign of respect. This, according to her parents, was a reflection of her integrity as a person of faith, a good Catholic girl. Based on my findings, these values are the pillars of Mexican Catholicism, though it's beginning to change to a certain degree. We still have a lot of work to do. However, when such values have no parameters, children are led to believe they have to be obedient under any circumstances, carrying the potential for death-bearing consequences, as in the case of Candelaria. She goes on. Because of how I was raised by my parents, when I married, I would lower my head when my husband insulted me or hit me. I thought he would come across as disobedient. If I talked back to him, he would tell me about the other women he was having affairs with, and he would be very explicit, and I would do nothing but cry. The last time he hit her in Mexico, he grabbed her by the hair and dragged her through the house, threw her against the cement wall, and hurt her abdomen, back, and head. She was 3 months pregnant with her 3rd child. When she arrived in this country, Candelaria enrolled in a series of workshops that were designed for Latina mothers. One of the things that she remembers most is how they taught her to not tolerate abuse, that there was help available for women in these types of situations, and that this was a free country. It was at these workshops that for the first time she realized all the damage her husband had done to her. In our interview, she shared about the first argument they had here in the United States. It was also their last one. She was 5 months pregnant with their 4th child. She recalls that when her husband started arguing, she took a deep breath and counted to 10, just as they taught her at the workshops. However, that did not help. The workshops alone, at least for Candelaria, were not enough to change her situation. The mental abuse continued that afternoon. He told Candelaria that before she joined him in this country, he had a lover for 4 years. He continued to torment her by telling her that the only thing she had to pay for was a room where she gave him what he wanted and that she would make love with the lights on. Minutes later, he began complaining because dinner was not ready. Full of rage, her husband threw her hard against the wall, just as he used to do in Mexico. She told her daughters to go directly to their room and lock themselves in. She then told her husband, she told herself, I am not going to be scared anymore. I am free here in this country. It is at this point that the workshop she had attended in the United States and her devotion to La Virgen transformed her into a woman of faith and resilience. Quote, I prayed to La Virgen to give me strength to be able to yell back at him. I prayed to her so that I could be me. This was something impossible for me to do, but I held on to La Virgencita. I told him, and I told myself, she will give me strength, and I will tell them exactly how I feel. I went to my daughters and told them, let's pray to La Virgen before you go to bed. We pray Psalm 14. The psalm is a direct prayer to God, yet Candelaria directs it to La Virgen, explaining, quote, I pray this psalm with my daughters with so much faith in La Virgen. Her evocation of this psalm demonstrates the fluidity of the Mexican Catholic imagination. A prayer to God can also be a prayer to La Virgen. Terrified of her husband, she begins to pray with her children. Deliver me, Lord, from the wicked. Preserve me from the violent, from those who plan evil in their hearts, who stir up conflicts every day, who sharpen their tongues like serpents, venom of asp upon their lips. Keep me, Lord, from the clutches of the wicked. Preserve me from the violent who... Her husband storms in. Before she could finish her prayer, he got her and threw her against the wall, then hit Candelaria in the face with his fist. But she got up and remembers telling La Virgen, Virgencita, the time is now. I told my husband, I do not know what is going on with you. I am not the same anymore. I am a different person. I am now here in the United States, and I know my rights. I want you to respect me, and if you have something to say it with manners. I ask you in the name of God and La Virgen to change. He told me, if you do not shut up, I will break your mouth. Then I felt my stomach trembling and my lower abdomen began to hurt badly. My hands were shaking, my mouth, all of my body. I felt like the world was crumbling down on me. Then my oldest daughter told him, I'm calling the police. He responded, call the police if you want, and you'll see what I'm capable of doing. He then threw their 15-year-old daughter on the bed and was about to hit her when Candelaria yelled, "A mi hija no, not my daughter." Candelaria was very scared. She felt the child she carried in her womb begin to move rapidly. She began to count to 10, just like they taught her in the self-esteem workshops. But this time, she called upon La Virgen as she counted. Something she did not do the first time. Ay, Virgencita, ayúdame, te necesito. My dear Virgin, help me, I need you. She then grabbed her 175-pound husband from the back, lifted him up, threw him on the floor, and yelled back at him for the first time in the 16 years of marriage. A mi hija no le pegas. You are not hitting my daughter, Candelaria continued. My daughter tells me, Ama, it was La Virgen. My daughters have strong faith in God and La Virgen. I tell my daughters, La Virgen has helped me so much. If it would not have been for her, I would have not had the strength that day, and things would have been the same. Adrenaline-infused strength surely helped in the moment, as did the sense of freedom she felt in the United States. But it was an enduring relationship with La Virgen, a faith in a faith in her abiding presence as a mother and a woman for women that had deep spiritual meaning for Candelaria. La Virgen was for her a presence of strength and resilience that had been nurtured in her Catholic imagination since childhood. Candelaria ended up divorcing her husband. I recently ran into her. She's a different woman. She's now bilingual, assertive, happy, and at peace. She now drives a car and works full-time to support her youngest child who still lives with her. In conclusion, these are only two of the many life histories about faith and resilience I document in my book. Who these women say Our Lady of Guadalupe is does not necessarily reinforce stereotypes of Our Lady of Guadalupe as a submissive mother. According to the women, La Virgen de Guadalupe accepts people just the way they are because they are her children and her love is unconditional. But they do not translate these attributes as qualities they should aspire to acquire. Within this imagination, the relationship that women have with Our Lady of Guadalupe is continuously shaped by women's sense of self, experience, and devotion to her. While this relationship anchors Our Lady of Guadalupe in Catholicism, it nevertheless is articulated in ways that unbind La Virgen from the more restricting aspects of Catholic teachings about and for women. In La Virgen, they find peace in the midst of their personal struggles, strength to act rather than to endure, a humility that does not embrace humiliation. La Virgen de Guadalupe for these women is Our Lady of everyday life and Our Lady of brave transformations. Thank you.
Thank you, Socorro. Our next speaker is Alicia Galvez from the New School. She's the professor of food studies and anthropology at the New School. She is the author of Guadalupe in New York, Devotion in the Struggle for Citizenship, Rights Among Mexican Migrants, from 2009, Patient Citizens, Immigrant Mothers, Mexican Women, Public Prenatal Care, and the Birth Weight Paradox, Rutgers 2011, and Eating NAFTA, Trade, Food Policies, and the Destruction of Mexico, University of California 2018. And her title is Food for Healing, Food Sovereignty Movements in Mexican and Mexican-American Communities. Alicia.
Thank you. I just want to start by saying it's an honor to be here, and I want to thank Ben and Julia and John and Chris and everyone who had a hand in putting this together, and our hosts here at the Mexican Cultural Institute, as well as Georgetown. I think it's funny, actually, that Ben invited me to do this and gave me actually quite a lot of room to roam, because I said, I'm not really working so much on religion. And he said, I'm sure you can find a way to connect it. And so it was actually a wonderful, productive invitation, because I realized I had been observing more than maybe I had noticed until you gave me that invitation. And you were the one who invited me to Colby at the beginning of my last project. So who knows, maybe you're in the process of midwifing another project into being. So I'm just going to start with a few snapshots of different moments. And the first moment is the early 2000s in New York City, 2000, 2004, when I was conducting dissertation research that focused on the way that the Catholic Church was a really important site at the time for mobilization around immigration rights. And transnational Catholic institutions were playing a very active role in fostering social ties between communities divided by borders, and really arguing for the acquisition of the rights of immigrants across borders. There were assertive discourses about the rights of migrants. The U.S.-Mexico Council of Bishops was playing a very strong role in terms of the statement, "This is strangers no more." The archbishops of LA, Chicago, New York, Mexico City were, really articulating a very strong argument for immigration rights. And it felt that there was a momentum towards immigration reform at that time, and that the vocabulary might be pushed towards the more radical, less radical, but that there was an inevitability toward the push for immigration reform, that the arc was definitely bending toward justice. It makes me very sad to think back that that sense of inevitability didn't pan out, but obviously we still have not had immigration reform, and in fact we now have an incredible climate of xenophobia. This was a time when people asked for amnesty unapologetically, and now even the word amnesty has been stricken from our vocabulary. But at the time, there was, so much creativity in terms of new forms of pastoralism, such as priests serving transnational migrant communities like Father Gustavo Rivera in the Diocese of Puebla, who regularly traveled to minister to migrants in New York City and Michigan and New Jersey and other places. We have the Antorcha Guadalupana, the binational Guadalupan torch run, which powerfully folded together the pre-Columbian practice of relay runners with torches carrying messages with, obviously much later elements of Catholic Marian devotion. And then the Antorcha really, was a creative way of delivering the prophetic message of the Virgen de Guadalupe as Empress of the Americas, really calling on this notion of the continent, being unified, irrespective of the imposition of borders, the unconditional recognition of the humanity and therefore the human rights of all people, the use of biblical rhetoric to render illegitimate and immoral man-made borders that separate people. But in intervening years, things have changed quite a lot, not only in politics, but we can see there's a general crisis of the church. Someone made reference earlier, obviously, to the rising wave, to the sex abuse scandals. There's also the rising wave of global secularism, and the specific crisis of Mexican Catholicism. And I am not sure, how to characterize it personally. There are other people who can do it better than I. But I think, for me, from my points of observation, I think there hasn't been a satisfying response to the rise of violence in Mexico and the failure to secure the human rights of migrants in the transnational sphere, which has led to a crisis of legitimacy and a search, perhaps, on the part of many who would be Guadalupanos, outside for answers. So part of my perspective comes from having worked a lot with the generation that was, running the Antorcha, and now, in the last decade, teaching their children in the city university system in New York City. And so having a different, generational perspective through those students. I think also, when we look specifically to Mexico, there's, we can see just in the last federal election results, an overall dissatisfaction with the pious, technocratic, socially conservative, and yet voraciously capitalist model of development of Vicente Fox. In my most recent trips in Mexico, I heard at least 3 people talk about how Vicente Fox kneeled before the Virgen at the Basilica, and his president, when he was running for president in 2000 for the PAN party, he was seen to really use religion in a way that was unprecedented in terms of the way that hegemony in modern Mexican politics had, the longstanding norms about the official as well as performative separation of church and state. And arguably by mainstreaming his own Catholicism, he actually set it back because he made it, kind of a PAN thing, and perhaps lowered its legitimacy, especially for some younger people, at least from the people that I've heard from. And I think that there are obviously sites of cultural innovation that are new inroads for evangelical churches. And also, unofficial, even illicit kind of iterations of syncretic Catholicism. So we see, the growing visibility of, the Santa Muerte cult and other cults that are semi-Marian, but not obviously officially recognized. I'm inspired in my analysis by the work of Guadalajara-based anthropologist René de la Torre, who for 20 years has analyzed devotional practices both within and outside Catholicism. And she writes of popular religiosity as an intermediate point between institutional religion and individualized spirituality. She writes that popular religion offers a space between the local and the transnational, between the social and the individual, between the holiness of the worldly and the worldliness of the sacred, that makes it possible to take into account the phenomena of religion practiced on the margins of institutions, as in New Age and Neo esoteric expressions, while attending to the processes by which new deinstitutionalized forms of religion legitimate themselves. Seeking anchorages and lineages that would create a continuity with the weight of tradition. So building on her framing, I would like to move on to a second snapshot, which is October 27th, Sunday, October 27th, I land in Mexico City. I have to go what is ordinarily a 15-minute drive to my hotel. 3 hours later, with the Uber driver in tears, we arrive at the hotel, and the Uber driver tells me the whole time how the Dia de los Muertos parade has become, this massive celebration in Mexico City, and that this was, in spite of the rain that day, the historically largest. And I said, why now? And he said, well, the James Bond movie. So I didn't realize this. Apparently there wasn't really a Day of the Dead parade until the James Bond movie producers decided that the Day of the Dead would be, even more amenable to filming if it were a parade. And so we see this, incredible, proliferation. I think a lot of people probably said, well, that isn't something necessarily that was done historically, but why not? Sounds good. It's an even, more culturally specific iteration of something that's already being done. And we can't discount Disney Pixar, and a lot of people talking in Mexico about both the Disney Pixar movie Coco, as well as the new Mexican production that's coming out this year. In terms of kind of fostering, there was this sort of conversation about Day of the Dead kind of falling away and being Halloweenized. And, now we see this sort of resurgence of interest in it. And, I think we see these intersections of mass media, consumer culture, with longstanding culturally specific Mexican traditions, offering new formations of modernity that are culturally specific, but also very global and very transnational. And I want to just cite one more film in my trio of films, which keeps coming back, to my thinking about keeps resurging in my own thinking about this, which is Sleep Dealer. Raise your hand if you're familiar with this. Oh, thank goodness. I'm evangelizing now. Go watch this film, please. So this came out 10 years ago. It's by Alex Rivera, who's usually a documentary maker, makes really wonderful documentaries. This is his only science fiction feature film. In it, people who would be migrants in Mexico, it's a near future dystopian science fiction. People who would be migrants instead get these ports kind of placed on their bodies, and then they plug in these sockets, and with the sockets they can paint, a skyscraper, a building in Chicago, or wash the windows of a skyscraper in New York. Of course, the robots are doing the work, but people wearing these sockets are doing it in Mexico, and the evil corporation that kind of invents this system in the film says, in their advertising materials, all the labor, none of the migrants. And I think that 10 years ago, Alex Rivera really tapped in. Thank goodness we're not living that particular iteration, but obviously automation and post migration is real. And I write in Eating NAFTA about, living in a post-migration, post-labor era, where our models for understanding the U.S.-Mexico relationship have to change, because people are no longer migrating in large numbers. And in fact, the people's contribution to the economy has less to do with their labor productivity and much more to do with their consumption. And so I think that a lot of the longstanding social formations and ways of constructing meaning are transforming as we speak under our feet. And we have to, expand our understanding of what community is and what religion and spirituality is. And so my third, moment snapshot is to think about food sovereignty and a rising trend in both Mexico and in Mexican communities in the United States and other Latinx communities towards really thinking about food in a spiritual way. And so there are lots of examples of this, which I'll kind of walk through, but I think that food and thinking about food sovereignty are offering new kinds of spirituality that offer responses to deterritorialization, racism, structural violence, xenophobia, and patriarchy. There are, and I would like to frame, some of the, I'll give you more examples to kind of concretize what I'm talking about, but I would like to understand a lot of the thinking about food and diet as queer and Black, Indigenous, people of color centered spiritual and bodily practices that are connected to pre-Columbian foodways and forms of spirituality and forms of bodily discipline, and also connected to land and places, but also have a heavy Catholic component as well. And so just, to go back to kind of, thinking about food historically, we have in the Florentine Codex lots of talk of tamales. If you're you can get hungry hearing all of the different kinds of tamales that are chronicled. But we also hear about amaranth cakes in the form of effigies to the dead, which were later prohibited by the Spanish. And today in 2019, we have a large number of cooperative agricultural communities planting amaranth for the first time, promoting amaranth not only as a health superfood, but as something that has spiritual meaning, that offers a certain level of resolution of, conflicts of identity and place and history. Let's see. So just a little bit more about tamales in the Florentine Codex. So we have movements, for example, like Sin Maíz No Hay País, which is a large social movement, which probably is not on most people's frames, kind of thinking about religion or spirituality in Mexico. It's really an organization that's thinking about food sovereignty and heirloom corn in Mexico as a location for thinking about how to push back against the forces of neoliberalism, of global trade, that have made the economic calculus that it makes sense for Mexico to no longer grow corn and only to import its food from the United States, where food is grown so abundantly and cheaply and blah, 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 and then export it to Mexico, which is now supposed to, in the NAFTA era, only, make cars and airplanes and yeah, thank you. And electronics. And so we have, these kind of movements that people are participating who seem not to be participating in a lot of formal religious practices. And then we have informal practices which seem more individual, but if you start to trace them on the internet and Instagram, you see that they're actually pretty social and creating some kind of alternative communities. So things like decolonized diets as a mode of sociality. And, there is a book called Decolonize Your Diet, which is a wonderful book by Luz Calvo and Catriona Rueda Esquivel, which is a combination manifesto and cookbook. They make the case that cooking is not just about food, it's also about spirituality. Luz writes, having my hands in the soil, literally grounding myself in the soil was very powerfully healing for me, she writes, during her her struggle with breast cancer. Food is a sense of connection. It connects me to Mother Earth, but also to my ancestors. It almost feels like I can feel their presence when I'm cooking something that I know my grandmother used to cook. And this reminds me, they identify as Chicanx, theorists and teachers in the Bay Area, but it reminds me of Aslan, as a spiritual homeland that is transnational, that stretches over both sides of the border, and Ansaldua's notions of Mepantla and of remembering the Coyoshauki, imperative of reknitting together that which has been dismembered by structural violence, border policies, etc. And Ansaldua really writes about dismembering and then remembering as a kind of praxis. And so I would like to just kind of pose a notion of what has been framed by some psychologists as orthorexia, and even framed as an eating disorder, as a psychological pathology, this notion of food rules that a lot of, probably, at least according to my small sampling of my students, everyone seems to be engaging in some kind of food rules. But I would like to posit it not as a pathology, but as a spiritual practice. We can go back, to the medieval saints who fasted and fainted, etc., that kind of embrace alternating with denial of the body and bodily experience. And these kinds of practices as kind of a syncretic mashup between aspects of Catholic and pre-Columbian practices that offer new kinds of insights into the moment that we're living in today. And once we start looking for these, we can kind of see this proliferation of art. This is from Galeria de la Raza. We can see that it's not particularly new. We can see, La Tamalada, Carmen López Garza's famous work, this sort of notion of the conviviality of food and of certain foods, especially corn-based, milpa-based cuisine, as offering not only bodily substance, physical sustenance, but also spiritual renewal and regeneration. So I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And next, Denise Brennan. Denise Brennan is my colleague at Georgetown University. She's professor and chair of the Department of Anthropology and co-director of the Gender and Justice Initiative at Georgetown University. She's the author of What's Love Got to Do With It? Transnational Desires and Sex Tourism in the Dominican Republic, published by Duke in 2004, and Life Interrupted, Trafficking into Forced Labor in the United States, which was published by Duke in 2014. She's currently completing a book on undocumented lives in the U.S. border regions and metropolitan areas beyond. Denise.
Great, thank you, Matt.
Alicia's much taller than I am. I also want to thank the organizers, especially John Tutino, to whom I also said I don't work on religion. And I live here, and this is one of my most favorite spaces in Washington, so it's just always a treat to have an excuse to be in this beautiful space. So how do we seek protection, right? And I took out of my wallet a card I carry with me everywhere that my Irish Catholic mother gave me. It will protect me from a fiery death. It's a prayer to St. Joseph. So how do we seek protection? So my remarks today draw from, I'm an anthropologist, right? So I've been doing anthropological research for the past 4 years with undocumented people or mixed status communities, really, both in the 100-mile border zone, which is where 2/3 of the U.S. population live, which is an enhanced immigration enforcement zone, but also in the interior. And my interest in this topic grows out of interviewing the first recipients of trafficking visas throughout the United States and going to like potlucks and protests and, different workshops with them. And they would be the only ones in the room that had immigration relief. So that's what brings me to this. As an anthropologist, I was interested in the quiet moments in people's lives, not the spectacular stories of arrest, raids, abuse. And I just wanted to find out, how do people go about their day under the constant threat of detention and deportation? So today I'm going to share just some findings, some of which are a little bit of a counter-narrative to what we read in the press. So let's see. I wanted to open with two framing quotes from which I draw some guidance. This is by legal scholar Daniel Kanstrom, who runs the Immigration and Asylum Clinic at Boston College, and he asks a really simple but thorny question: should people forever be subject to deportation, right? And this is a question that has animated my research, and I think, what is the just way forward, not just for the 11 point whatever million people that are here without the right papers, but what about future newcomers? So we see so acutely right now these politics and policies of white supremacy producing a lifetime sentence, an original sin that is never lifted. Okay. So I turn to scholarship and activism to answer thorny questions like, should people forever be criminalized? And Keongo Yamato Taylor makes clear in her fantastic treatise, Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, you can't really be free when the police are able to set upon you at will for no particular reason at all. It is a constant reminder of the space between freedom and unfreedom. So the cruelty has been breathtaking, hasn't it? This is by an earlier ICE director. There have been many. You should be looking over your shoulder, right? So today I'm going to quickly sort of touch on how people protect themselves. And I'm going to talk a little bit about faith, a little bit about strategy, a lot about activism, and also how out of all of that, there's this refusal, resistance, and resilience. That's the 100-mile border zone. So I've been really struck by how mixed status communities counter racialized surveillance and policing with strategies of invisibility to the state, with this hyper availability and generosity to their own communities. So I'm going to focus on sort of these two communities, faith communities and activist communities. And I'm inspired by the idea of love politics that Jennifer Nash describes as undergirding Black feminism. And we really see it fueling an intergenerational, undocumented activism, both by trained professional organizers that maybe how they earn their pay, but also ordinary members of mixed status communities. Okay, we'll get to this. Let's see. Let's talk about a few findings. So border policing happens far from any border. It happens here in DC, it happens in the middle of New York City. And I have been really struck by how entangled people's lives are along the literal border, where we're going to hear from Sean and his amazing work. Undocumented people's lives entangled with documented people's lives. As a documented activist told me, our kids go to school together, we work together, we stand in line at the supermarket together. So there's this simultaneous invisibility and obvious presence of undocumented people. In places like Tucson, where the Keno Border Initiative works. This documented activist, Ruby, told me nearly every household has somebody who's undocumented. Her own father works occasionally in Border Patrol houses, right, doing like some construction work. And a Border Patrol agent whose family I've been following, he works the line kind of a little outside of the Tucson sector. He sees people out running errands, right? And he says, well, they see me, he sees people he has arrested and he knows were deported. And he says, they see me, see them, but if I'm off duty, I don't do anything. So I think the narrative that we read about people living in the shadows is just off. People are living in parallel, undocumented people in mixed status communities. They're going about their day with care and caution, but they're not in hiding. They have to go, to work. The title of my talk, God Will Look Over Me, is from a woman. She and her son both volunteer at this dynamite clinic, immigration clinic, undocumented led in Tucson. And she drives all over Tucson in order to do her activist work, plus go, to her clients cleaning houses. And I, ask her, don't you worry? And she has strategy. She's like, no, if BP is behind me or police or highway patrol, I don't drive too slowly, but I drive, carefully. And I always say prayers, God is looking over me. So what is happening in the shadows? It's the dirty work of the carceral state. I've spent a lot of time in what you might not know as a border community, might not think of it as a border community, and that's Jacksonville, Florida. And they don't have a progressive, really well organized, undocumented led community like Tucson. In fact, there's this really thin NGO community there. So the people I met they don't talk about themselves as activists. They're just members of the community that get the word out through WhatsApp or Facebook posts. If there are news of not raids, this is what we read about in the news. What's really going on is, BP hiding across the street and watching brown men in white vans, as I say, go into like a Latino grocery store and come back out and then pursue. So I've been interviewing a gentleman named Israel who, this is exactly what happened to him. He's not really an ordinary person. He owns 15 white vans, runs a big construction business, hires a lot of Spanish-speaking folks that work with him. And so throughout the whole incident, when he was stopped, he stayed remarkably calm when he describes the Border Patrol agent heating up, angry that he handed him a valid driver's license, explaining that the BP agent really wanted like some kind of Mexican ID card. The whole time Israel is filming on his phone. So this is this element of, resistance and refusal. And then later in the station, the BP agent realizes he's been filmed, and he said, I didn't give consent to be filmed. And Israel says, I didn't give consent to be put in your car. So that's a very, and he had never been to a Know Your Rights training. He hadn't gone to parents' preparedness workshops. So I'm really interested, and his story wasn't in the news, but I'm really interested in this refusal to not, be free to drive around, and do your work. But the other thing in Jacksonville, in Spanish-speaking communities, this is known that ICE in unmarked cars, and ICE does this throughout the nation. I've been to organizing meetings here in the DMV. ICE frequently will be doing, I call them stakeouts, in not only unmarked cars, but unmarked. They have no signage on them, nothing, right? But quite dastardly, in Jacksonville, they'll go to gas stations and they'll lie in wait and and guys will pile out of a white van, go get their morning coffee, some pastry or something, and then when they come out, ICE is there. So it's hard to say enough prayers to protect yourself against this, right? It's hard to, what strategy do you take? You have to set out for work. Oh, this is the Latino store outside of which Israel was stopped. So, and this is a barbershop in Jacksonville where a woman who is documented, she's from Colombia, and she knows a lot of guys. I sort of feel like her space is sort of this revolving door for undocumented Jacksonville. So she knows a lot of guys.
And they trust her. Hello? So they will, can you hear me? Yeah. So they will,
oh, my own talk show host. My own talk show, yes. So they'll text her when there may be like a roadblock, and then she just goes crazy on Facebook, right? So it's a really, again, this is not something we hear in the media. These are ordinary people. They drop everything. They're just, they're trying to protect their own. So how are we doing on time?
7 minutes.
Okay, so let me fast forward. But lately I've been thinking about breaking points, right? What the limits to which resilience, resistance, and refusal, can be put. In this environment of ever-mounting hateful anti-migrant rhetoric and policies, right? When do you stop being unafraid, right? What we hear from dreamers. And with nearly everyone facing setback after setback, crises are expected, if not normalized. Solidarity practices and love politics may be an antidote to vilification and dehumanization, and so are prayers and hanging across from one's car mirror. But they're clearly no match for the policies that split families apart and produce poverty. So some folks I've noticed in Jacksonville and Tucson are deciding to return. There's so this barber and a woman who runs a food truck, I call them modern day town criers. And so the food truck owner has cousins who just got so financially stretched trying to pay for their daughters to go to community college, pay the full freight, that they've decided to just return to Mexico, which means that's it. They can't get back to the U.S. without a dangerous desert crossing, just so they can live without looking over their shoulder, as the ICE director warned, but more specifically so their girls can go to college and have the same opportunities, my kids and Alicia's kids are having right now as college students. There's the documented activist I told you about in Tucson, who I call Ruby, whose father occasionally works in Border Patrol houses. She describes her parents as being, depressed. Work is drying up. Her mother's finding that clients, there are a lot of retirees, white retirees in Tucson. Of late, they're asking for proof of citizenship. They're having some health issues. They have difficulty accessing decent health care. They're talking about returning. They're talking about getting Ruby and her brother, both who have DACA, getting them on their feet and then returning. But the real breaking point for Ruby came when she and her mother were uninvited from their church's ladies' teas. Ruby had been, she is very vocal in doing local press, and the pastor and his wife were unhappy with Ruby's media interviews, and unhappy with her involvement at the undocumented-led immigration clinic. And, in her own words, she describes herself as incredibly
gregarious and enjoying new social spaces and new experiences. And, she now says she's really unmoored. She feels unsafe in new places. She's been saying no to a lot of things because it's just really rocked her, right? So to conclude, the threat of detention and deportation does not force people into the shadows, but into a social location, a place of unfreedom with fewer rights, security, and an increased likelihood of threat, exploitation, and abuse. What's really frustrating living in DC is this is all a technically fixable problem, right? But until then, undocumented individuals and mixed status families are going to rely on one another, their activism, and their faith. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. And next is Sean Carroll. Sean Carroll is the Executive Director of the Keno Border Initiative, providing counseling and services to migrants and refugees in Nogales, Arizona. His career is focused on providing ministry and social services to diverse Mexican-American and migrant communities in California and along the southwestern border. And his talk today, Sean will be speaking on lessons of faith learned from migrants on the U.S.-Mexico border.
Thank you, Matt. So I'm just really grateful to be here, and I know we're at the end of the day the last person, so thanks for bearing with me. And I want to thank John as well, Tino, and the sponsors of this event, and really for this invitation, because I feel like I'm an interloper and a non-academic, and yet John said, no, there's something really important I want you to bring here, your perspective from the border, your experience there, and really how religious practice comes to play for migrants and for people who are on the move. And so what I'd like to do, just really simply in my presentation, is just to present three anecdotes and three experiences I've had, and then explain what I have learned and perhaps what we can learn from those experiences in terms of the practice of faith, in terms of religiosity, and how that comes to play in migration, and in particular on the border. So a year ago last summer, and really up until that time, so in our work, we work in humanitarian assistance, education, research, and advocacy. And we have been serving mostly people who have been deported from the U.S. to Mexico, mostly men, about 75-80% men, about 20-25% women and children, actually very few children. So about a year and a half ago, we noticed that there were a lot of families coming north. And this wasn't a new phenomenon, but when they were coming north, they would be admitted into the port of entry quickly. But beginning around the end of April, Customs and Border Protection was very slow to receive them. And so the number of people in the port of entry really started to grow. From 30 people to 50 people to 80 people to 100 people. I mean, sitting there without being able to bathe, access to food, really a crisis situation. So a list was developed and a whole process to take care of the people's needs there. But in the midst of that process, and I was spending a fair amount of time there just because of the situation and accompanying people there. And I got to know one woman who was there with her daughter and her niece. And so we got to talking, and she was sitting there waiting and felt a relationship of trust. And she said, I want to show you what's in my backpack here. So I'm thinking, what is she going to show me? So she opens it really slowly. She reaches in, and she pulls out a newspaper article. So I begin to read it. And what I come to discover is that this is a news report on the murder of her mother, who had been making her living selling clothing and goods on the streets. And because she couldn't pay the extortion fee, her life was taken. She reaches back in her bag again. And this time she pulls out a photograph. And as I look at that photograph, it's of a tomb. Well, she comes to tell me and says, this is where my mother is buried. She doesn't stop there. She reaches again into her bag. And she pulls out another photograph. But this time it's of her husband. But it's not just any portrait of her husband. He's lying there on a bed in their home. He's holding up his arms that were both bloodied. I mean, this is covered with blood because people involved in organized crime had beaten him to a pulp. She reaches in her bag again. She reaches for a police report that she had filed because she had been verbally threatened. And so this really kind of direct contact with this person and looking at these images and hearing these testimonies and experiences really kind of brought home for me what people are fleeing. And really right now, we are seeing a large percentage of people, particularly from the state of Guerrero. And what we saw happen in Culiacan some weeks ago really is the reality in different parts of the country, in particular in the state of Guerrero, where those groups involved in organized crime are fighting over turf and people are caught in the middle and they literally can't get to work, or they can't even leave their house, or people enter their house and say, leave now or else. And so that forces people to flee. And so whereas last year we might have served 5% of the people we served with fleeing violence, now it's 27 or 28%. The other thing I want to share is that with the deportees that we've been serving, we formed cooperatives. And we've done that because not only to teach people a new skill or to empower them to use skills they already have, but also so that in those cooperatives and through the products that they make, it's a therapeutic process for them. And so one of the cooperatives we set up was a cross-painting cooperative. And so the men that we serve and who have been deported, we provide the paint, we provide the wooden crosses, and they paint different images on them. And what's been really powerful is just to see what people paint on them. It's the expression of their experience, and really partly where religious experience comes to play. And one of the images that particularly really struck me was that one of the men, and he was a great painter, and he's painted many crosses, I looked at this image and he painted the border wall. You've got green grass underneath it. And he painted Jesus crucified on the border wall. And as I think about that image, and as I look at what really speaks to me is just this deep identification of their suffering, obviously with the suffering of Jesus. And what it really expresses is just this experience of what we're seeing now. Over 50,000 people sent back to Mexico under what they call the migration protection protocols. The over 7,000 people, but actually probably much more than that, who have been killed or died along the U.S.-Mexican border from 1998 to 2017. The 90 people who have been killed by interaction with a Border Patrol agent on the border in recent years. I think of Jose Antonio Elena Rodriguez, a young man, 15 years old, walking along the border wall one night in October 2012, and a Border Patrol agent ran up to the wall and emptied his gun into him, and he was then later declared innocent of murder and of manslaughter. So it's just, I think that image just really expresses in a very powerful and profound way just this people's connection migrants' connection of their own suffering to the suffering of Jesus. And the third thing I'll talk about is that every year in December, and so it's coming up very soon, is a celebration of Posada. And as many of us know, this is a tradition that's been in Mexico for centuries. I think since the 16th or 17th century, if I'm not mistaken, since the 16th century. And so this this idea of in what's becoming in neighborhoods where people process from home to home, and it's this call and response. And so really the people outside, being Mary and Joseph, looking for a place to give birth to Jesus, and the people inside saying, "Go away, you're not welcome here." And then at the end, people are receiving the welcome, and they share food together. But what we do on the border is we do what's called a binational posada. And so what that is we have people on both sides of the border wall, and we walk around there, and we do that call and response through the wall. And so, please let me in. Please welcome me. I'm looking for a place to stay. And this experience of rejection, go away, you're not welcome here, you don't belong. And I remember, and really through, and along the way, migrants give testimonies of their own experience of rejection. So I think of one woman who we served, who was working in Phoenix and working in a factory, and she was there with as she tells it, with one of her fellow workers who was Cuban, and one day the sheriff came, and she had nowhere to go and nowhere to run. She was arrested and deported and separated from her 3 children. I think the youngest was 15. And not only just what the words she spoke, but if you sat down and you've talked to people who go through this experience of deportation, just the unspeakable pain of being separated from their children. And really there are just no words to describe that pain and what that is. And so in this testimony, she just really sobs, and as you listen to her, it comes from just the core of her being, this experience of being separated from her family, and not being able just to share those life events that if we have children, we're just so used to sharing, birthdays and graduations, and that all of that is gone. And so what have I learned, and perhaps what can we learn from just these 3 simple anecdotes or examples from the border? Well, I think one is just, and really these brief lessons I want to share here, we've heard about today and have historical roots. And so one is just the role of religion and empowerment. So this woman I met in the port of entry, it wasn't Father, pray for us. It wasn't lead us in prayer. One night when I was there, what she would do at 8 o'clock was she would gather everyone who wanted to gather and lead them in prayer. And they'd pray for an hour. And so she led me in prayer for an hour. And really reminded me that religion has a really important role in terms of empowerment and in terms of people's sense of who they are. If we call Catholic social teaching, that it's this whole idea that we are made in God's image and likeness. That gives us a certain dignity, it gives us rights, but also gives us responsibilities. And so powerful just to see someone who's just so aware of that, of who they are and whose they are. And really in this practice of faith is empowered in the midst of very difficult circumstances and uncertainty and doubt. Will I pass by credible fearing of you? Will I be reunited with family? Will I be able to have safety? Will I be able to find a dignified life in the United States? And in the midst of that, and through the practice of faith and religious practice, to experience that sense of empowerment and say, no, I can lead people in prayer. I can, and I think, my experience of working in parishes with Latino communities over the years, just seeing that over and over again, you see that very powerfully, whether it's in the home, whether it's in church, or in really anywhere is sacred space. And where that dynamic can come to play and happen. And I think the other lesson is just that in the practice of religion, that it's not just based on a past event, but it's past events that are real in the present. And so when you look at the image of Jesus crucified on the border wall, it's not just Jesus crucified 2,000 years ago, but it's men and women and children experiencing crucifixion now. And yet they don't do it alone. I think an image like that really shows that based in faith, there's a deep sense that Jesus, the divine, is with them, is suffering with them, is walking with them, and will lead them through that somehow. And so there's a real redemptive quality to it, and this real, I think, bridging between space and time. Something that happened in the past, but also, and something that happens in the present and is real and is true. And then the third thing I would say is just the power of religious practice and its expression in public, and especially in terms of engaging social issues. And we've heard some of that, today, just throughout Mexican history and the inspiration by Our Lady of Guadalupe to engage various social questions and change social realities. And I think certainly on the border, I've seen that the binational posada is an example of that. Another is that I worked at a parish in East Los Angeles for 4 years, Dolores Mission. It's one of the Jesuit parishes in California, and we had base communities there. So we had communities of people just in the neighborhoods, and I think there's some here, some liberation theology, this idea of reflecting on the gospel that Sunday, and what do we see in our reality in the context of that gospel? And what's this say to us? And then how do we put that into action, whatever the fruit of our reflection is? And I just remember just the that through that reflection and through that mutual support and religious practice, how that empowered our community to engage different social questions. So, for example, ICE was conducting a number of raids in our parish when I was there at one time, and so we worked with the base communities, and through that reflection, that led to a huge march to the ICE building in downtown Los Angeles, and not hateful, not bitter, but a real kind of public expression of opposition to this practice that was happening, but really coming from a deep place of faith and really expression of a deep religiosity that drove that movement. And really in that community over the years as well has really helped not resolve completely, but resolve to a degree issues like around gangs that are present there and the improvement and well-being of the neighborhood. So just to conclude, I would say I want to just talk about experience that we had some years ago where we had a mass on the border, and it wasn't the first time that's happened, but it was particularly poignant for the following reason. So we're there on the border, and we had lay people, we had bishops, we had priests, and we had migrants in the Mexican side of the border, and so we're literally right up against the border while having this mass together. And so the moment came for communion. And so Cardinal Malley from Boston and Bishop Joe Cacanas from Tucson walked down to the border, and they gave communion to people through the wall. And there's a picture of Bishop Cacanas, and you look at the expression on his face as he gives communion to this person, and you see the hand extended through the wall, and so a simple mass there at this place that's really a symbol of rejection in some ways is really transformed into this space of solidarity, into this space of unity, into this space of connection, into this space of common humanity. And so I think that simple example just encapsulates in a powerful way kind of what's possible and what's real through religious practice. And I think migrants, at least in my experience on the border, are prime teachers of what that means. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you all, four of you. And this truly did bring it right up to date and right up to the very lived experience of so many people with a visceralness that I found myself at times really deeply moved as each of you spoke. I wondered, in a moment we'll open this up for questions. I might just throw out one that I'd love to hear you all reflect on a little bit more. So the title of this particular panel was Religion in Migrant and Mexican American Communities. And I just want to highlight two of those words. So religion, which a number of you spoke about in different ways, and communities. And when I think about migrants, and especially people on the move, people who are in the experience of, at some point, maybe their families move, so being undocumented, religion and the sense of community have been sometimes sustaining for people. Now we live in actually a time, though, where both of those characteristics are somewhat problematized. So religion, for a number of the issues we've talked about earlier today, religion we know is always in a somewhat contested space, even as we think about the history inside of Mexico. And then communities that have been fragmented and broken in so many ways are fundamental. If there is a U.S. community, it's been very much fragmented of late. How do you think about those things? How do we build, or how do you address those as you think about your own work in this moment when it can seem like what could be mainstays in previous times, a transmitted vision of Our Lady of Guadalupe, a transmitted vision of a God who protects me, that now actually is so questioned in the public sphere for so many ways, and communities, church community that sometimes can seem so broken. How do you think we think about those two things in particular, I might ask? Maybe no one wants to
speak at once.
Yeah.
So community and
religion.
And religion. Okay. Yeah.
And you spoke to this some, especially about religion in a sense as a uniting force, but we know that actually some of the migrants may not have had the same experience of religion that that the Commodore provides, right? So especially in a religiously plural or religiously fragmented population.
Yeah, at least I think one thing that helps, in terms of that kind of communal sense, and not only just among migrants, but people who aren't migrants as well, is it's really humanizing the issue. So one of the things that we do in our organization is we host a lot of students, mostly from colleges and universities, sometimes from parishes as well, for what we call immersion experiences. So these experiences of direct service and dialogue and reflection, and one of the key components of it is the actual dialogue with the people that we serve. And so I mention that because I think for most people that we host, they've never met a migrant, or they've never, and yet when we have that encounter, when we hear someone's story and then they share it as well, there's something powerful that happens. We do kind of build community in a sense, and then people going home thinking about, well, how do I tell the story, and how do I volunteer, and how do I advocate, or how do I do some combination of that, and living out that experience. And I would say frequently when people leave, they carry these people with them, inside of them, and they remember people that I or others don't remember, because we're serving so many people every day. So I think that's so I think for us the question has been, how do you humanize the issue, but in a broader way, and in so doing build that sense of connection, that sense of solidarity, that sense of community. And I think for the migrants themselves, that at least when they're in our facility, whatever their religious tradition is, or if they're non-believer, I think when they're together and they're in the space that we provide, or maybe even outside that space, I think that common experience of seeking a better life, or fleeing violence, or wanting to be reunited with family is a point they have in common. It's a unifier, and so you'll hear people who come up on the bus, on the train, and they may not even know each other, but they connect because well, because they're threatened, because they're in danger, and certainly migrants who are coming to the border, and for the reasons that I mentioned, face all kinds of obstacles, and I think, in the face of challenge and adversity, that brings people together in a powerful way. I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, I've had the privilege of being down in the Commodore quite a few times, and Sean hasn't said this, so I will. It feels like a sacred space to me, and I watch people. And there's a mural of the Last Supper. It's like not a grand place, by the way. It's like kind of seedy and grimy and small, and they do remarkable things. They do not just, serving a meal, but bandaging people up and letting them use the phone. But I watch folks before the meal is served, and there's no way everyone's actually religious. It just statistically can't be the case. But it's hypnotic to watch where people are transported, because you're also, at least I'm not sure, I can't tell if people have just been deported or if people have just crossed and been through. especially looking at the women, you think, oh Lord, what have you been through? So it's just, it's a deeply, deeply sacred place. The other thing, I wanted to say that people that I've interviewed all over the United States say the same phrase, and it's not on a bumper sticker. It's not a protest slogan, and that's that they say, I do what I can to help the community. I do what I can.
I think that the diocesan level, what we need is more training in Latinx ministry. Because I think that sometimes what parishes lack are pastors and lay leaders who really fully understand the spiritual needs and fully understand the social context of the immigrants in that particular community. That you have a Latinx pastor or that you have Latinx ministers does not necessarily translate into individuals that understand that reality. And I say that because that happened to a few of the women that I interviewed when, for example, one of them said that in Mexico, she was used to always going for confession every Sunday before Mass. That was something that she did. That's something that everyone did. When she came to the U.S., she went to the priest and asked for a confession. And first of all, he was a Latino an actual Mexicano from Mexico. And he said, well, I'm about to start Mass. I can't confess you. And then she's like, but I need to confess or else I won't be able to take communion. And then he got very upset. And then he asked her, well, have you killed someone? Have you had an affair? Have you abused anyone? And she's like, no. And so then you don't need confession. And then he just left. And she said, I just felt that just like the world just came down on me because I didn't understand. So again, it's that we need pastors and lay leaders to be very sensitive to the spiritual needs of the immigrant community, and that not to make the assumption that because they are Latinx pastors, Latinx lay leaders, are they going to understand, and that they don't need any training. I think everyone needs training.